Assessing the legacies of national leaders is not an exact science. Politicians and their ideas are no less subject to the vagaries of fashion than pop songs or cuts of trouser. The issue or idea that seemed important at the time seems frivolous or ridiculous a few decades on. The Prime Minister or President condemned as a buffoon and a charlatan by one generation of pundits may be admired as a sagacious statesperson by the next. Where US presidents are concerned, such turbulence is especially severe given that a minor industry exists in ranking occupants of the White House against each other. The fluctuations can be somewhat giddying. The first such survey of scholars for Life magazine in 1948 awarded predictably high marks to Abraham Lincoln, George Washington and Franklin Roosevelt, but damned Ulysses Grant and Warren Harding as the two most abject failures. A more recent poll of boffins by the Presidential Greatness Project garlanded the same top three, but had Grant in 17th, only narrowly behind Woodrow Wilson and Ronald Reagan, and Harding at least out of the relegation spots. Last by some distance in that one, incidentally, Donald Trump, who American voters have nevertheless awarded the opportunity to make up some of those places beginning January 20th. It is, therefore, as good a time as any to consider how a presidential legacy is assessed and maintained. What makes a president great? Why do our views change over time? And how do you uphold the legacy of someone who not only failed to even become president, but lost 49 states in the attempt? This is the Foreign Desk.
He really put the South on the map in a different way. He put a liberal perspective, a very open to the country, which is very different from what people thought Southerners from the Deep South were.
Andrew Jackson was, in certain respects, America's first populist president.
If we think about the kind of person that Bernie Sanders has been and his emphasis, his willingness to talk about poverty, I mean, that was McGovern. He was that person that was interested in doing things that lessened the poverty and the hunger that was out there.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. The United States' 39th president was also its longest-lived and arguably its most distinguished former president. First of all, a look back at Jimmy Carter's life in and out of the White House.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of
Jimmy
my ability,
Carter could not have won any other presidential election in US history, and indeed he didn't. He became the 39th President of the United States in 1976, running against the profoundly uninspiring figure of Gerald Ford, the only man in American history to have served as Vice President and President without ever being elected to either office, and a Republican Party exhausted and tarnished by the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. Carter lost office 4 years later, thrashed 44 states to 6 by Ronald Reagan.
Reagan is our projected winner. Ronald Wilson Reagan of California, a sports announcer, a film actor.
The rest of Carter's life would be spent trying to persuade America, the world, and perhaps himself that this judgment of his presidency had been unfair. James Earl Carter Jr. was born to a farming family in Plains, Georgia, on October 1st, 1924. After graduating from university, he served for 7 years in the US Navy, including a stint as an officer aboard a submarine. Back home in Georgia, after leaving the armed forces, he won election to the state senate in 1962. Throughout his career, Carter perceived no conflict between his conservative Baptist background and a passion for civil rights. Indeed, he believed them parts of one whole. He was a staunch pro-Kennedy Democrat, which wasn't always an easy thing to be in the American South of the 1960s. However, in a symbolic shift in 1970, Carter replaced as Georgia's governor Lester Maddox, an old-school race-baiting fire-breather.
based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Carter positioned himself as the embodiment of the so-called New South, propounding a folksy liberalism that would later be sold more cunningly and successfully by a young Arkansas lawyer called Bill Clinton. Carter convincingly won the 1976 Democratic nomination for president by seeing off two other governors who represented his party's eccentric extremes, Jerry Moonbeam Brown of California and George Segregation Forever Wallace of Alabama.
Fellow citizens, I thank you for the nomination you've offered me.
Carter's brief presidency was not without domestic accomplishment. The establishment of a Department of Education, a shoring up of Social Security, a reduction in unemployment. But the purse-lipped, homespun piety that he brought to Washington from plains was never far from the surface. In 1979, with the country beleaguered by an energy crisis, he gave a bizarre sermon, the so-called National Malaise speech, in which he admonished Americans for being self-indulgent and materialistic. He might not have been wrong, but he was assuredly unwise to say so.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
It was abroad that Carter really floundered, and worse, was seen to flounder by an American people who'd grown used to the idea that they were an awesome, undefiable superpower. Carter's presidency became defined by events in Tehran in 1979, when 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days by zealous students under the command of radical cleric, the Ayatollah Khomeini.
The lives of our people in Iran are at stake. I must emphasize the gravity of the situation.
Though rescue attempts were planned and one attempted, with tragic results, Carter and America with him were made to look impotent and indecisive. As a crowning insult, the hostages were released literally as Carter's successor, the indefatigably optimistic matinee idol Ronald Reagan, was taking the oath of office.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
His greatest legacy may be the work of his NGO, the Carter Center in Disease Control. When the Carter Center began tackling the ghastly parasite guinea worm in Africa and Asia in 1986, it affected 3.5 million people. In 2024, 7 cases were reported worldwide. That astonishing accomplishment in itself would amount to a laudable legacy.
No poor, rural, weak, or black person should ever have to bear the additional burden of being deprived of the opportunity of an education, a job, or simple justice.
On balance, Jimmy Carter deserves better from posterity than being remembered principally for having spent 4 years of a long and productive life doing a job for which he was spectacularly ill-suited. We're joined first of all by Meredith Evans, director of the Jimmy Carter Library in Atlanta, Georgia. Meredith, let's start with the remarkable fact of President Carter's 100th birthday last year. Where you were sitting, did that prompt an uptick of interest in his life and work?
It did. I think people are fascinated that he's lived this long and want to know more about him and about his work. Some remember him because they voted for him, and then many have no idea who he is. So it was a wonderful opportunity.
Do you get the feeling that views of his legacy have changed since 1980? Obviously, when you're voted out as a president, you're starting from a pretty low bar in terms of what people think of you. But do you think that the decades subsequent to that have been kinder to Carter's presidency?
That's a great question. I think that to some extent, Yes, I think people have looked at the hostage situation and the admittance that he actually did free the hostages differently than they had in the 80s. But most of all, I think people dwell on his post-presidency more than anything because he's lived so long. And I just like to remind people that there would be no post-presidency if he wasn't president. So his extension from the United States to global work is the heart of his post-presidency. But what he did for the nation during his presidency and his time as governor of Georgia really was impactful on the United States in many ways.
I do want to talk about the post-presidential decades because they are remarkable. But before we get to that, when we just think of, for good and for bad, the legacy of the 4 years he spent in the White House, how would you quantify that?
I think he tried to build the great society and make sure that our country, the land, and our policies were lasting. And that's not sexy to the average person, but he did it. So we have quite a bit of land that is preserved around this country that cannot be built upon in order to save not just our environment, but give people places to go, to hike, and just enjoy nature. I think he spent a lot of time encouraging people to be wise in their spending during a really tough time and really focused on creating oil and creating things that in our own country that we could utilize so that we weren't reliant on other people. So I think there's some things that he did that weren't sexy but are very smart. Solar panels on the White House and thinking about alternative energy, creating a Department of Education so that we could standardize some things across the nation, like reading and math and just very specific areas to study to make us competitive with the rest of the world. So I think there's things that he did that are great society, big ideas that people won't reap the benefits for, for years after he left office. And I think that was a tough decision, but it was a smart one.
And also thinking back to his presidency, does he now seem perhaps like the last of a particular kind of politician? I know another Democrat from the South did follow him into the White House in the shape of Bill Clinton. But when you look at the 1976 electoral map from today's perspective, it's extraordinary. A Democrat from Georgia wins the entire South and Texas.
Yeah, I think what he did was amazing. I also think he really put the South on the map in a different way. He put a liberal perspective, a very open to all walks of life, race, gender, ethnicity, to the country, which is very different from what people thought Southerners from the Deep South were. And I think he changed the image and really platformed Georgia and Atlanta specifically in a way that no one ever thought was possible and that we here in Atlanta are totally reaping the benefits of today. So I think what they thought about the South, that all white men were racist and cruel and, that the slave trade really didn't end, that really stopped by the time he was in office because he started that change as governor, but he really made the change he really changed minds, I think, in the presidency. There's a lot of interesting kind of campaign materials that they use, but also commercials that were like, Carter, who is this person? A peanut farmer? That's not a leader. Turns out that he is a leader, right? And his upbringing led him to be the open-minded leader that he is. And I think that focus on diplomacy that he has in the post-presidency, really he used his entire political career, right? How do we get along with each other? How do we have different values or different views on things, but still work towards a common goal? And he did that in office. If he had had a second term, he probably would have been more successful. I don't think he will ever admit that choosing to focus solely on the freeing the hostages and not going to campaign was a detriment. I don't think he'll ever say that. I think he's proud of his work and the way he did it.
You mentioned earlier that the 4 years he spent in the White House did provide the springboard for this extraordinary post-presidential career he had. A lot went on there, but does it strike you that there is one aspect of what he accomplished out of office that he was and is especially proud of?
I think he's proud of his work, his global work, because he's reached so many countries that have been neglected or ignored by other nations, right? So I think he is proud of that aspect. I think the techniques he used in Georgia as governor really translated as president globally. So the work, the guinea worm work in these remote spaces, really helping people with trachoma and eye diseases in these really remote places. He's going to places where people didn't want to go or didn't hear of, people who weren't educated, cosmopolitan, and that's not the case. And he discovered that and does the work that most people weren't, at the time he started that work, weren't willing to do. That's an amazing feat to me. His ability to speak with dictators, I think, is also is amazing. Has that ability to want to have a sit-down conversation with somebody with fundamentally different beliefs than him, to promote democracy or just to promote an opportunity to hear from the people you govern. I mean, these are the things that he learned that he did during presidency, but really extended to other nations when no one else was doing it.
I do want to ask about the Carter Library as a place to visit, if any of our listeners are inspired by this conversation to go and take a look. As somebody who probably, certainly knows it better than anybody else, do you have a particular favourite exhibit that you like directing people to?
Yeah, actually I have two. We have his birth certificate on display where it specifically says, although his name is James Earl Carter, we will call him Jimmy until he's ready to be called James. And I can tell you he's never been called James and he's 100. So that's one of my favorites. And then there's a section on Mrs. Carter and her just ability to work with him in the work that he does. And she traveled, she did refugee work as First Lady, and their relationship was strong. She was a First Lady that sat in meetings with them, with dignitaries, and with him to have conversation, and he was very open to that. And so we have a whole section on that. That's just fascinating.
And I do want to ask, just finally, as somebody who is fascinated by American political kitsch and probably has far too much of it in their house, what is the best-selling item at the Carter Library shop?
The bobblehead of the former president. We have a bobblehead, and that has to be, that comes off the shelf so quick, it's hard to keep up with it.
Meredith Evans, director of the Jimmy Carter Library in Atlanta, thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. The United States' 7th President, Andrew Jackson, divided opinions at the time and since, possibly at least partly because his presence on the $20 bill keeps him in the American consciousness to a greater degree than most. But in more recent years, certainly, because Jackson's persona of rumbustious anti-establishment rabble-rouser reminded people of someone. We're joined now by David Brown, historian and author of The First Populist, The Defiant Life of Andrew Jackson. David, first of all, we are interested in talking about Andrew Jackson because he has acquired a certain contemporary relevance. What does it tell us that Donald Trump, a Republican, has been so keen to associate himself with Andrew Jackson, while Andrew Jackson's own Democratic Party now kind of prefers to pretend he never existed?
I think what it tells us is that populism is in vogue among Donald Trump and many of his supporters. And Andrew Jackson was, in certain respects, America's first populist president. He was the nation's 7th president, but the first not to be born in either Virginia or Massachusetts. And so he was really the first Westerner, and he benefited from increased suffrage from white men in the 1820s. Jackson was somebody who could not have been elected earlier than the moment that he was. We look at Jackson and we see this man who had a plantation in a officer's uniform, and we associate him with a kind of aristocracy. but he was not a George Washington. He was not a John Adams. Those men really were East Coast quasi-aristocrats. Jackson was not. And I think that that's what Trump is tapping into, this notion that Jackson was a man of the people.
With due allowances for the evolution of language over all that time, was Jackson's rhetoric when he was running for president and running again for president essentially similar? Was it that populist shtick of, I will stand up for the ordinary person against the establishment who are conniving against us?
You know, where you see that in a real strong way is in the bank war. So there was this national bank. Jackson was opposed to it, and Jackson thought that it gave the wealthy and the elite in America certain advantages. And Congress had agreed to recharter the bank, and Jackson vetoed this. And in the veto message, he identified the farmers, the mechanics, the laborers, the working people of the country. That was the language that he used. And he said, it isn't clear to me why these people, these wealthy, who have been given so much already, should have an even greater advantage, this bank, which we know that these farmers, mechanics, and laborers, they can't go to. They'll be sent to smaller banks. And so Jackson really did have that rhetoric of class privilege, and he was a critic of class privilege, which explains why Democrats, up until about the 1950s or 60s, were advocates of Jackson. They embraced him as one of their own because they saw him up until that time as an advocate of the working people in America.
I mean, it's always a question that I think is prompted by the modern populist when they start talking about how I will stand up for the common person against the establishment, even if the person who's saying it is a billionaire celebrity who lives in a penthouse in Manhattan and has a solid gold bathroom. Whether or not they're actually entirely serious and sincere about this, or whether this is just something they're saying to get elected. Where do you think Jackson fell on that question? Did he mean it? Was this a matter of principle for him, or did he just think this is what'll work?
I think Jackson probably did mean it. He never knew his father. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was in his early teens. He was farmed off to family. He never liked that situation. He went out west and he began to accrue money and position and whatnot. But nothing like we have today. You know, when Jackson became a national hero with the Battle of New Orleans, he and his wife, they still lived in a log cabin outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Just the fact, you know, that when Jackson got married, his wife was actually still married to her first husband. She didn't realize it, but she was. And so that was a bigamous relationship. And Westerners, they looked at Jackson in a log cabin. They looked at his marriage. And they saw these people in the East, you know, attacking him for that marriage, attacking him for his rough ways and his rough speech. But they really identified with him. And I think because they saw something in Jackson that was close to them. Yes, Jackson had position. Jackson had a plantation. Much of this came later in his life. But when he was building his political roots and career in Tennessee, there were a lot of people in Tennessee who could see Jackson as, in some sense, attitudinally, at least, one of their own.
But this is another aspect of the populist that you see even in the modern populist. There's always, whether it's actually there or whether they sort of pretend it's there, there's that chip on their shoulder. There's that desire for revenge against those elites that they believe have looked down on them or have put them down. And Jackson was, as a person, famously bad-tempered and vindictive. Is that where that came from, do you think? Was he driven by a desire to get even with people, either on his behalf or on behalf of others?
That was certainly a strong feature of his emotional makeup. And he had a way of really making it a strength. Jackson was never so efficient, effective, and focused as when he had an enemy to set his sights on, whether that enemy really deserved it or not. You know, in the 1824 election, Jackson got more popular in electoral votes than the other three candidates. But the Constitution says that you need a majority in the Electoral College, and none of the four had that. Jackson came closest, but he didn't. And so when the House of Representatives voted, they didn't vote for Jackson, they voted for John Quincy Adams. And that gave both Adams and his followers this great enemy, the kind of deep state circa 1824, 1825, which was, as the Jacksonians would have it, the elite interests of the East, the financial interests of the East, and the political class of the East, who would refuse to see a man from the West, a man who, quote unquote, embodied the will of the people in the West, to see that man become president. And so Jackson had this, great gift of really defining his enemies for his own people. And that election, it was a momentary loss, but it really was also the founding myth of Jacksonian democracy, that the people had spoken and they went for Jackson, but a corrupt cabal of Easterners stole it. Obviously, this was a myth because most Americans did not vote for Jackson. He had a plurality, but he never had a majority in that election.
We're talking in this episode about presidential legacies, and I'm just wondering how you think views of Jackson's legacy have changed, especially in recent years when his name has come up more and more often, largely at the invoking of President-elect Donald Trump. As recently as 2000, I think I'm right in saying a Wall Street Journal poll ranked him the sixth greatest president. But in the years since, of course, aspects of his life, like the fact that he did own slaves, like his pretty monstrous treatment of Native Americans, those have become, I guess, a more prominent way of measuring previous presidents.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Jackson's reputation was high. It started to begin to wobble in the 1960s and 70s with the long civil rights movement. And that has only continued. And so what that tells us is something about ourselves as well as Jackson, which is where our priorities are these days. Trump's been around for, about 8 years in presidential politics. That doesn't seem to have had an impact on Jackson's reputation, which is still, sort of, depending upon what poll you look at, low 20s, mid 20s. I think the thing that you have to consider about presidential reputations is what you're measuring for. Is it popularity or is it consequence? Jackson was a consequential leader, so I would rank him higher than the 20s in that, if you look at the bank war, if you look at Indian removal, if you look at the nullification crisis, if you look at what he meant to so many voters, whether one likes him or doesn't like him, he was an extremely consequential figure. Probably the second most powerful president in the United States in that century, in the 19th century, behind only Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was because of wartime powers. Jackson was extremely controversial, but he was also very consequential. If it's about how we look at Jackson through the prism of our own concerns and interests, then yes, I'm not surprised that his reputation has dropped.
David Brown, author of The First Populist, The Defiant Life of Andrew Jackson, thanks for joining us on The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. One doesn't need necessarily to become president to bequeath a considerable political legacy or make a contribution to presidential folklore, even if it is not the kind one might have intended or preferred. Twice in US history, a major party candidate has lost 49 states, Walter Mondale in 1984 and George McGovern in 1972. We're joined now by Joel Allen, director of the McGovern Center in Mitchell, South Dakota. Joel, first of all, if we, or indeed any of our listeners, were to come and visit the McGovern Library, what is there for us to see?
Well, besides a beautiful library with a fantastic statue of George and Eleanor right as you walk in, there's a wonderful McGovern Legacy Museum that tracks. It's a fairly small museum, even though there's a lot to say, and it tracks the beginning of his life through to ending with a special emphasis on his anti-hunger work, which was the focus of his life, really the whole of his life, especially when he was serving in the Air Force or the Army. Essentially at that time he was a bomber pilot, and just experienced the desperation of Italian children, the level of hunger that they were experiencing. It broke his heart, and he came back. He was a kind of a playboy before he went to college. When he came back from the war, he was very serious about, like, how can I fix this messed up world we're in, and was very serious most of the rest of his life, searching for ways to reduce world hunger. And that became the theme of his life.
Is that part of the mission of the library, though, to try and remind people that there was much more to McGovern's record than what was always going to be the first line of his obituary, that he ran for president in 1972 and lost 49 states?
He did win the District of Columbia, but the sad part there, too, is that he didn't even win this county, the county I'm in right now. He didn't even win his own county. No, that was very much a heartbreaker for him. He had already had a long interest in hunger issues. John F. Kennedy appointed him as the director for a program called Food for Peace. And he ran it very, very effectively and traveled all over the world in the early Kennedy administration. And then a seat came up after 2 years in the Senate. He had already run in 60, and then he ran again in 62, won that seat, it still amazes me to this day, as progressive as he was. I mean, he was as progressive as they come. He was the Bernie Sanders of his day, and that he could even get elected in South Dakota. But a large part of it was that he was very interested in these Food for Peace programs, and farmers like that because they were able to sell their grain.
I mean, I don't want to harp on 1972 because it's assuredly not what he would have wanted, but what sense did you ever get of how philosophical a view he was able to take of that defeat afterwards? I'm wondering, maybe is it kind of easier to absorb losing an election by a colossal margin than losing a very, very close one?
I think it's harder to lose a bit, the way he lost. I mean, both he and Eleanor suffered tremendously. I mean, especially they felt like their own state. They would have liked to have gotten South Dakota. And they even moved to Montana. They considered moving to England for a while just because it was such a devastating loss. So there's no getting around the fact that he was devastated. But he did make a conscious choice to use humor to approach it and to not weep in his beer too much, out in public. And his kind of standard joke was, I wanted my whole life to run for president in the worst way. And last year I sure did. So,
I mean,
so he did really work at that. And he was even on Saturday Night Live one night after his third round. He ran for president actually 3 times. And in 1985, he ran in 84. So he took the humor seriously. Like, as I said, you can go to YouTube and find the clip of his being, and it's very funny. So he did work at that, but he was always committed to hunger as his primary issue. And he was able to make good money after, he traveled around the world giving lectures and made, significant amount of money that way. But he still had this driving passion for world hunger and ended up working for the World Food Programs and was an ambassador for them for many years, traveling all over the world, assuring that these food programs were being properly run. And then there was one specifically that he and Bob Dole together worked on and got through with President Bush and Clinton. And then Bush supported this program, and it was called the Food for Education program, which still to this day is in high mode operation. It's in 42 countries, over 20 million meals delivered every year. It's by far the largest school-oriented feeding program out there, by far. He took hunger seriously and sacrificed personally to make it happen because he could make really good money giving lectures. And
do you think it was any consolation to him personally that he did end up quite soon after 1972 being proved quite right about a number of things? I mean, obviously within 2 years, President Nixon has demonstrated his manifest unfitness to serve and has had to resign in disgrace. The United States has withdrawn in considerable ignominy from Vietnam, a conflict McGovern had opposed. And of course, by 1976, the Democrats, led by Jimmy Carter, are back in the White House.
Back in the White House. Who would have guessed that after the landslide of 72? But yes, there's no doubt that he felt proven right by those events. But it still was, he felt like people still had a tendency to think of McGovern as unelectable because he's too liberal and the wide-eyed liberal. And he would always point out, look, if I was some kind of wide-eyed radical, I could never win over 20 years of being in the House or the Senate from South Dakota. There's just no way a wide-eyed kind of radicalized person could do that. But he was able to remarkably win seats in the House or the Senate. And actually, his campaign went very, very well until the night of the Democratic Party, and I think it was Memphis. The whole convention went awry. He didn't even get to make his speech till 3:00 in the morning. And then right after that, Tom Eagleton, it's reported that he had been taking electroshock therapy for depression, and he had to drop him from the ticket. It was a mess. It just, everything kind of fell apart.
It is a long time ago and a very different United States, but is it arguable that there are any lessons there that might be applied to the Democratic Party today about how one recovers from a fairly devastating defeat? Or was it just the Watergate factor that changed everything between 72 and 76?
Well, Nixon had a lot going for him before this, right? I mean, the war was going a little bit better. The economy was getting better. So, yeah, there was a lot of things that had been improving. And so I guess the reason I say that is because McGovern, even under the best of circumstances, was certain to lose. Nixon would have been absolutely unbeatable. In fact, Tom Knock, the great historian of McGovern's life, has said that to me personally. There was no way. There was absolutely no way. But still, I think our nation kind of woke up to realize that Richard Nixon actually was involved in this. And there was a certain amount of, on the McGovern side, a certain amount of, well, you should have listened to me. Because he was screaming about Watergate, and he felt like the more he talked about it, the lower his numbers went. And he had tried so hard to open up the Democratic Party to everyone. And he had done that through the commission that he was on. It's called the Fraser-McGovern Commission. He had changed the party rules so that everybody could get involved. And he said, so I opened up the door of the party and half the Democrats walked out. It was a complicated response. There was no absolute vindication. He felt hurt, but he also felt committed to moving on and to continuing his work for it.
Just to close by coming back to kind of where we came in, I mean, every US presidential election, any election anywhere, is a fork in the road. It is a point at which a nation decides what course it is going to take. And despite everything you've just said about how everybody probably knew in 1972 that McGovern did not have a prayer, if we are to come and visit the McGovern Library one day, is there, do you think, one particular exhibit in there that gives us some inkling, some idea of what might have been different, not just after 1972, but in the decades since? Had, for example, I don't know, the Watergate scandal breaks 2 years earlier, Nixon implodes 2 years earlier, and McGovern somehow wins.
I think that, part of a way to answer this question is if we think about the kind of person that Bernie Sanders has been and his emphasis, his willingness to talk about poverty and not always talk about the middle class. I mean, that was McGovern. He was that person that was interested in doing things that lessened the poverty and the hunger that was out there. So when he was the chair of the committee for the nutrition and human needs, he and his staff wrote the legislation that has now become a part of American life, the CHIPS Act, the food programs that are part of our national life that come from the McGovern committees that McGovern served on, along with Bob Dole, interestingly. So I think it would be more that kind of thing. I mean, the museum does emphasize that aspect of McGovern, that food, the concern for the poor, organizing American life so that the needs of the poor are more carefully met. And so I think that we'd have more of rather than a focus on economic prosperity for the wealthy and the middle class, more of a focus on people who are impoverished. And that's a tough message in this day and age. But really, that's what Bernie Sanders is saying right now, that the party's left behind that message and has paid a price for that.
Joel Allen, director of the McGovern Centre, thank you for joining us on the Foreign Desk. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota, Chris Chermak, and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mullett, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.